Welcome back everyone, I'm History with Hilbert, and today I'd like to make a response video to the videos that Scholagladiatoria, also known as Matt Easton, put up on his channel the other day. Now he put up two videos about the Vikings, and as always when I'm making response videos, this isn't a personal attack on his channel at all. I really enjoy his footage, and I would highly recommend that you guys go and check out his channel as well. It does all sorts about history, mostly kind of the weapons and armor side of things, which is a really interesting take, as well as having lots of replicas and being essentially a really knowledgeable guy, which comes across in both of his videos. He really does know what he's talking about, and he references a lot of things. However, I did disagree with him on a couple of things, and I'd like to maybe put in another perspective. But again, this isn't a hit piece on Matt Easton at all. I really enjoy his stuff. This is essentially me just trying to bring something else to the discussion. So one of the questions that he essentially asks is, were the Vikings, the people we call the Vikings these days, were they worse than the rest of the people at the time, or are they sort of just the same as everyone else and unfairly demonized? That's one of the main sort of themes, and I apologize, this video is going to be all over the place. Scholagladiatoria's videos were a bit rambly and all over the place as well, which is fine. So this one, in true responding fashion, is going to be exactly the same. So I apologize, Matt, if you're watching this, and anyone else, but I hope it'll still be informative and interesting. So one interesting comparison is to look at sort of the Viking Age, which tends to start around 793 AD, which is the raid on Lindisfarne, and tends to end around usually 1066 is the given date. Arguably you could take it up to a bit later, but for clarity's sake I've gone 800 to 1100. And if you contrast it to the sort of heroic age, that isn't actually the name of an age, that's something that I've put together now. It's sort of the bit before the Viking Age, when you had all sorts of people, kind of when Beowulf is set, when you have the Saxons and the Danes and the Gates, or the Yates as you're meant to call them, and things like that. And it's interesting to compare the two, because as Scholagladiatoria correctly says in his video, going Viking and being Scandinavian during a certain period are different things in the contexts of how they use these words back in the time. And the idea that people didn't go Viking as they meant it in Old Norse when they wrote it before the Viking Age is, as he says, incorrect, and people definitely did. And I've got a few examples of that before the start of the Viking Age. Now, of course, with the Northumbrians, the Northumbrian King Edwin, who came to the throne in 616 AD, he famously actually raided the Isle of Man, which you wouldn't really expect. He went out with ships and raided the Isle of Man. And actually Northumbria is famous and is often criticised by Irish monks because they would sail to Ireland in their ships, capture slaves and raid the place, and then sail back. But they aren't really referred to as Vikings. So that's an example of some other people, some Anglo-Saxons in sort of the heroic age, the start of the 7th century, doing similar things. And you've got exactly the same thing going on when later on, under the reign after Edwin is killed in 633, then Northumbria is invaded by people from the Welsh land, the kingdom of Gwynedd, as well as the Mercians. And what do? Well, they burn the place down, and we are told that there was a red slaughter in Northumbria where all of these good Christians were killed. And the worst thing was that the Welsh were meant to be Christians as well. So you can see that actually just because people were Christian didn't necessarily mean that they respected each other. Now there is an extra element there as well, that the Northumbrians, that Edwin's Christians were Roman Christian, and the Welsh Christians of Gwynedd, they were sort of the Brythonic Christian tradition that had lasted from the actual Romans. It's a bit complicated now, and that they didn't afford the same respect to one another as perhaps the Christians of the same, or dare I say, correct quote-unquote branch. Now another interesting example is actually later, and it actually is in the Viking Age, which was at the start of the 11th century, when the king at the time, Athelred the Unready, he ordered the massacre of all Danish men in England at the time in reprisal for the raids that the Danish kings at the time were doing, and were demanding huge sums of money called Danegeld, Dane money at the time. And he ordered all Danish people to be killed in England at the time. And essentially then you get a huge spate of ethnic cleansing, which is really bad when you think about it in terms of the 11th century. And this did actually happen. There was, I can't remember exactly where it was found in Oh, it's in Oxford, actually. In Oxford, I think they found somewhere around 30 to 40 bodies that had been completely, you can tell from the bones, they had been hacked to death and killed in the back. And DNA analysis showed that these were Danish men living in England, and these weren't Vikings, these were civilians. You've got to remember they came as Vikings first, as raiders, but very soon they were already settled into the population. You know, large parts of England, the north especially, the Danelaw, people came and settled and integrated into the community, and then these people were brutally massacred on the St. Brice's Day massacre at the time. So you can see that actually, in terms of this violent killing of civilians, actually the Anglo-Saxons were doing the exact same thing in certain instances to the Vikings. Although I'll get onto that a bit more later on as well. Now, another example would be actually the Frisians, and yes, I can hear some people groaning in the audience, but you know, I love to fit them in whenever I can, and this won't be the last time. When the Frisians under King Redbart at the time, they sailed down to Cologne, which is in the north of Germany down the Rhine, and we are told that they pillaged the entire way down. And actually, this was one of the great victories for the Frisians in the Frieso-Frankish War, and it's the only time that Charles Martel was defeated in battle at the Battle of Cologne in 716 AD. So you can see it's a bit earlier than the Viking Age, but they pillaged right the way down when they went to war, and this was a normal thing. And again, we know about this probably, and this is a theory I'm going to elaborate on later on, because they were heathens. The Frisians at this time were still pagan, so I think there's a lot of bias. When people are pagan, people make sure to write down about all the terrible things they did, but when people were Christian, they kind of shoved it under the rug a little bit. And I think I'm going to elaborate on this later on as well, but I think that might be one of the things I disagree most with Matt Easton on, because he kind of says when you're in the Christian kind of union, and I think he had a great analogy about the UN. I think he certainly has a point, but then I think that also we have to be a bit more cynical about who was writing things down and what weren't they writing down and what were they emphasizing. But a bit more about that later on. And actually, when the Frisians did this, they were described in the Frankish annals as the gens dirissima maritime, which means something like the awful sea people, and the Dutch have never been called anything else. And actually, another interesting story is that Bede, in the 7th century, I believe the story he sets around 679 AD, is that a young Northumbrian thane called Immer is captured in battle against the Mercians, and he is then taken to London and sold to Frisian merchants to be sold abroad. And this is again another example of slavery which is happening. And again, I think we know about this because the Frisians were pagan, and you can almost hear in Bede's writing how annoyed he is, because the Mercians at this time, it's too late for Penda. I believe Penda has already been killed, but Penda was a great pagan king of Mercia, who I think he killed something like 7 to 9 other Anglo-Saxon kings, including a few Northumbrian ones, which makes him a very interesting character. But Bede explicitly writes this down because there is the allusion that there is a Christian Northumbrian thane, so Immer, being sold into slavery by probably a pagan Mercian warrior to also a probably pagan, or well, definitely at this time, pagan Frisian trader. However, we don't really hear much else. There's evidence for Frisian traders in places like London and York in England and trading, but we don't hear much about Frisian slavers in England apart from this story. So I think it's much more likely that the slavers at the time would have been Irish and Frankish, because they had closer connections, obviously the Irish with Northumbria, but that we don't hear about that because, well, they were Christian and Bede was a monk. And what would he do to say, oh, these Christians are selling us into slavery? Now, actually, another interesting thing is that one of the images he shows, the one in the bottom there, when he's talking about Vikings killing civilians, is actually not in an image showing Vikings killing civilians. It's actually the martyrdom of St. Boniface, who was martyred in Dokkum in Friesland by the Frisians in the year 754. And actually, it's very interesting because that's just 39 years before the start of the Viking Age with the attack on Lindisfarne. And there you see that again, another people are killing. He was a monk. I really don't like him. He chopped down a tree in Friesland called the Donarseik in Dutch, which is the Thunor's oak tree, and that's why he was killed by the Frisians, because the Franks were trying to forcibly convert the people at the time. And again, that's just another example, and I thought that was quite interesting that he showed that picture, which is from the Fulda Sacramentorium, which I believe was made around 100 years later. It's 9th century, I believe. So that's quite another interesting thing there. Now, the Frisians lead me on nicely to trade, which is another point that I wanted to make about Lindisfarne. And this might not be a very popular point, and it's actually something that I picked up when I went to see a lecture by Max Adams. A bit more about that later on as well. Now, obviously, the people in the North Sea had been trading for hundreds of years, and before the Viking attacks from Scandinavia started, they would already have been very familiar with the British Isles. It's not like in Vikings, the first episode, where they're like, what, there's land across the west? No, they knew about land across the other side of the sea. For instance, in Swedish farmsteads, a few hundred years before the Viking Age started, we find artifacts from Ireland, and these hadn't been stolen, these would have been traded. And it's interesting, in the same farmsteads, we find things from as far afield as India, actually. There is a little statue of a Buddha been found in this, I believe it's in Helgö in Sweden, which is incredibly interesting because trade connected people at this point. And one of the largest trading peoples, again, would be the Frisians, who were sort of ideally placed between the British Isles. You have Frisians being found in Gaupang in Norway. They have a section of that city. I believe even Hedeby or Haitabu was actually founded by the Frisians when they moved up, or it might have been Ribe. And there's a Frisian part of the city in London and York, in Worms in the north of Germany, as well as Mainz, because they sailed right the way down the Rhine, so they could trade with the Franks, buy things like wine, sell the wine onto people like the Scandinavians in the north. And the Scandinavians were a huge part of this trading network across the North Sea. So they knew what they were doing. Before the Vikings, hundreds of years before they went out raiding and pillaging and raping and whatnot, they were trading. And this is why the Vikings knew where these places were, because they didn't just luckily sail across the sea and go, wow, Bob's your uncle, we're at a monastery with lots of wealth, what luck. No, they knew where they were going. And actually, I would pose that they had planned this for possibly quite a while. I have some reasons that I'll mention later on as well. And I think even it's very possible that when they arrived, they knew the monks on Lindisfarne. Because you've got to remember as well that monasteries, we tend to think of them as these isolated places where there are monks who sit and pray all day and do nothing else. But this is actually completely an incorrect view of monasteries at the time. Monasteries, especially in Anglo-Saxon England and arguably all over Europe, were powerhouses. They were essentially factories because there was a huge plot of land. They'd keep animals, they'd keep calves, they'd keep, cows, and they'd use the calf skins, the vellum, to write books. And there was a huge book trade in Europe at the time, with people making hugely beautiful books like the Lindisfarne Gospels, for instance, and the Book of Kells, which would be these illuminated manuscripts that were really worth a lot, and different monasteries and places would trade these books with one another. Now, not to mention that also monks would sit and work. They wouldn't just pray, but they'd have a trade. This could include copying manuscripts and writing manuscripts, but it's also things like making cloth, and a lot of these monasteries kept obviously sheep, so they could have wool to make their vestments from, but also they would have too much of this, so they'd sell it on, as well as having crops, because huge tracts of land were given to monasteries at the time, and they wouldn't waste this land. This would be land that they used to produce things, to make things, and they would definitely trade it on with other people because they couldn't keep it all for themselves, and that would then generate an income so that they could keep going. And I think it's very easy to say that a lot of the monasteries, especially in the north of England, Scotland and Ireland, were built on the coasts. It's the kind of idea of Iona, which is a Celtic Christian monastery, of being a hermit, of being, on the edge of things, which is why Lindisfarne was built, one of the reasons why Lindisfarne was built where it was on the island, on Holy Island, also because it was opposite the Northumbrian, or specifically the Bernician capital of Bamborough, or Bebbanburh as it was called in Old English, which sort of gave it a joint purpose. But I think it's really that the people who came over in 793 knew where Lindisfarne was, and I would say that they knew the monks who were there. And I also think that there isn't much of a case for that they slaughtered everyone on Lindisfarne. Now you might think that's ridiculous. Well, it says everywhere that they came and they slaughtered everyone and took everyone away as slaves. However, if this was the case, then a few months after the attack, Alcuin of York in Charlemagne wrote a letter to the monks of Lindisfarne. However, he wouldn't be able to write a letter to the monks of Lindisfarne if they had all been killed and enslaved. And actually, while Matt Easton says, it's easier to kill them, get them out of the way, actually, it's not a very economical thing to do. Imagine if you were a Viking and you attack Lindisfarne. There is wealth there, there are monks there who are making things, trading things, and gaining wealth. If you go there and you kill everyone, it's a very hard thing to repopulate a monastery, because, you need monks, for instance, as a start, but you also need a church hierarchy. You need people who are at the top of the hierarchy who know how to run a monastery. If you slaughter and enslave everyone inside that monastery, you can't go back there until it's been repopulated. You have to find another monastery. However, places like Lindisfarne, Iona, they were raided more than once, which suggests, obviously they left some people alive, which we can tell from Alcuin's letter to Lindisfarne. And as well, I'm not sure that the Vikings would want to kill anyone. It's not particularly economical. Sure, they could take some slaves and sell that. That's economical. But if they left people there, they knew they weren't going anywhere. And indeed, they didn't go anywhere until later on in the 9th century, when they did actually leave, because it got so bad because they kept coming back. But I think it was more a case of it would be better to take a few as slaves, take the riches, then come back when things were back on their feet in these monasteries, which I believe is what they did. So I'm not sure we do actually have that much evidence for terrible violence being committed against the monks. Of course, you could then say, what about the sources? What about the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle? These heathen men brought fire and rapine and slaughter to the monks of Lindisfarne. Well, yes, but they would write that, wouldn't they? Because, of course, they are the ones who are the victims, so of course they are going to demonize the people who have come and taken their treasure away. Which, to be honest, stealing from the church was, that was one of the worst things you can do. So the monks, I don't think they'd have any qualms about adding in, and they slaughtered everyone else. Because, they already thought they had done the worst thing, which was to attack a monastery. So, I think that's something we should be cautious of. Now, I could, of course, be completely wrong. They could just have attacked, absolutely been merciless, killed everyone they could find, and, a few of them managed to hide, or one or two of them were on pilgrimage at the time, so they managed to repopulate. But I think there certainly is a case for looking at these Viking attacks on monasteries as not being an outright slaughter fest, but rather a more well-planned, because, of course, they had been trading earlier. They knew how these places worked. And if they were trying to get goods, then they knew that killing everyone might not be the best way. And of course, then we've got to consider that the people writing about the Vikings, all the sources, pretty much all the sources in Europe were written down by clergy, because the clergy were the people who could write. And who was public enemy number one for the clergy? The heathen, especially the heathens who are trying to kill us and have burnt down our churches, stolen our nice crosses, and enslaved a lot of our brethren. So I think it's very easy to then look at the source evidence only and suggest, wow, this is absolutely awful. They must have been absolutely terrible. It would be like learning about birds from a worm's point of view. They're not going to be very positive about them at all. So another thing as well is the sort of why did the Viking Age kick off? Why were they so annoyed, and why did they target where they did? Well, I think one of the big things to consider is the expansion of the Franks into areas in the north of the Netherlands and Germany, which had previously been under the kingship of the Frisian kings and the Saxon kings and the nobles and overlords there. And as well, sort of the religious divide. The Franks, as Matt Easton, he knows about this, he definitely pointed it out to his credit, about the Franks and their trying to convert the peoples of the North Sea coast, so the Frisians and the Saxons, in both the Frisian-Frankish wars, the Frisian rebellions and the Saxon wars, with the point of the sword to try and get them to convert to Christianity. Now, as well, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had slowly sort of up and down the 6th and 7th century become Christian as well. And so for the people in Scandinavia who had, as I said, been part of this trade lane, religion had never been a barrier to trading, because they had traded with the pagan Anglo-Saxons, they had traded with the pagan Frisians, and it had all been fine. However, now the Frisians, who, as I said, they had a very pivotal position in this trade lane, they had been taken over by the Franks, and now the Franks had a say in, they tried to have a say in who and where they traded and the kind of prices. Now, it's very likely that this trade, which a lot of the richest Scandinavians relied upon, that this was influenced a lot by the Franks and by their conquering of the peoples of the Frisians and of the Saxons. Now, of course, a lot of Frisians, arguably up until around the 11th century, the Frisians weren't properly converted. They were still adhering to certain pagan practices in certain places. But it's very likely that this kind of Christianization was alarming people in Scandinavia. Also, the power of the Franks. We see very shortly after the Franks assert control over the Saxons that the king in Denmark at the time, called Gorm the Old, or Gorm Gamla, he starts to construct the Dannevirke in the south of Schleswig-Holstein. And essentially this was a huge fortification to try and stop the Franks from invading Denmark, which was a possibility that they had considered. Of course, as well, with the religious divide, you could argue that it's quite a new argument, which is an interesting one, and I don't wholeheartedly subscribe to it, but I think there is certainly a grain of truth in there, that this might have been reprisal for the quelling of pagan peoples in northern Europe. Like the Frisians, for example, they sent wave after wave of missionaries into these lands, as well as the Saxons, of course. The Saxon Wars and Rebellions being when certain Frisians and Saxons revolted against the Franks and against the Christianization that was going on, and those who refused to convert were massacred by, I think a few thousand people were massacred by the Franks, by Charlemagne, after they refused to convert. And it's possible that the attacks on monasteries were because they wanted to get revenge on the Christians for doing all of these terrible things, which is a possibility, but I think it's rather more political, probably because the trade lanes were changing. I think economics is usually a very large driving factor in history, including in this era. And I think the shift in trade lane, the shift of power from the Frisians when they were independent traders to now being controlled by the Franks, who then controlled the markets. The Franks, of course, controlled the wine, which was traded a lot of the time with Scandinavia. The Scandinavians wanted to sell things like amber and furs. The Frisians were happy to buy this and then to sell it on with the Franks, who wanted furs. But now the Franks were in control. They had much more of a say on the trade and things like that. And I think that might be one reason why the Vikings said, screw it. We're not going to start paying for things. We're going to start taking things because we're not happy with the situation that's going on at the moment. Now, on to Ireland. Now, there is quite a lot of mention about Ireland. There's a source from Ireland and saying, well, the Irish, they were absolutely harried by the Vikings and it was terrible, the things that the Vikings did in Ireland, and, so bad. And I don't want to, this may sound like I'm trying to sort of diminish what the Vikings did in Ireland. And I'm sure that they did do their fair share of plundering and committing atrocities in Ireland. However, I don't think Ireland was the best place to go with this, because in Ireland, the Vikings never controlled much land at all. In fact, the only places they did control were around their long forts, which was essentially where they built an encampment around their long ships to stay the winter, and these eventually turned into towns. So, for example, Dublin, Wexford, Waterford, Cork, and Limerick. These were really the only Viking places where they had any kind of control. The rest of Ireland was all split into various kingdoms and sub-kingdoms, which were then split into clans, tuath, and different family groups. Some of the larger ones I put on there, and actually much more of the fighting in this period was between these kingdoms, not between them and the Norse. In fact, the Norse kind of had two Viking ages in Ireland. One was during the 9th century, and then I believe in 902 they are kicked out everywhere in Ireland by the Irish, because they had a real trouble staying even where they were. They couldn't conquer anymore because the Irish were absolutely savage. They'd been fighting each other, and I don't mean that in a racist way, I mean savage as in they were very good at fighting. They'd been fighting each other for hundreds of years, and when the Vikings showed up, well, it was just another kind of another faction to throw into the mixer. And actually I've written a kind of, well, it's not exactly a dissertation, but I've written an extended essay on sort of this period about the Vikings in Ireland at the time, and especially the decline of the Vikings in Ireland. And it's very interesting because as you know, I know a bit about the Vikings in various places in England and Frisia and Scandinavia, but I'd never looked at Ireland particularly closely, which is why I decided to focus on that. And actually what I learned was that we tend to think of the Vikings as being a front seat player in Irish politics the whole way, that it was the Irish and the Vikings, which is also how the Battle of Clontarf is often portrayed. However, the Vikings were never particularly strong in Ireland. They were important, and I'll get onto that later, and they could pull their weight, but really it was the fighting between the other kingdoms in Ireland at the time that was much more brutal than that of the Vikings. But again, I think the reason we hear about the Vikings is because they were heathen, and because it was much easier for an annalist in Ireland at the time to write about, oh, these pagans, these foreign pagans have done this, rather than actually it was the Irish family from next door who were trying to assert control over this region, which is another interesting point. And actually the source he reads, I do have a few bones to pick with that. I'm sorry, Matt, but I don't think it was the best one to use in this case. And again, I think it's much more, the time was violent, but not because of the Vikings. It had been violent before they were there, and it was violent when they left. And I think it was much more the Irish fighting each other, and that the Vikings just got stuck in with this, and were as violent as the Irish were towards one another and each other. So actually I'd like to read just a quick source here, which is, they followed them also into the fort and slaughtered them. They carried off their jewels and their best property, and their saddles beautiful and foreign, their gold and silver, their beautifully woven cloth of all colours and of all kinds, their satins and silk cloth, pleasing and variegated, both scarlet and green, and all sorts of cloth in like manner. They carried away their soft, youthful, bright, matchless girls, their blooming silk-clad young women, and their active, large, and well-formed boys. Everyone that was fit for a slave was enslaved. And you might be going, aha, I knew it, the Vikings were in Ireland, they were pillaging towns, they were taking the women off and raping them, and they were selling everyone into slavery. Well, actually this is from the Siege of Limerick, and the matchless girls and the well-formed boys being taken away are Scandinavian. This is actually an Irish source, and this is about the Irish under Brian Boru capturing the city of Limerick, which was a Viking town at the time. So you can see that actually in Ireland it was an incredibly brutal scene. And while Matt Easton was saying, well, you know, all these sufferings that have been going on from the source he read, actually the source is from it is indeed 12th century, as he said. It's from the Cogath Gaedal Regalith, which in Irish, and I'm sorry if I butchered the pronunciation, means the War of the Irish with the Foreigners. And this is essentially a propaganda masterpiece. It's one of my sources that I used in this dissertation that I was talking about, and it was written a while afterwards by the great, I believe it's the great-great-grandson of Brian Boru. Brian Boru being the man who pretty much united Ireland at the start of the 11th century, and then went on to defeat the last great Viking coalition. Well, I say Viking coalition, actually it's a coalition of certain Norsemen and certain Irishmen in revolt against his Irishmen and some Norse allies on his side at the Battle of Clontarf, which is very famous in 1014, which was fought outside Dublin. But anyway, this source, the Cogath Gaedal Regalith, was written down in the time of his great-great-grandson, Muirchertach Ua Brian, and actually his whole purpose with this was to slate the people of Dublin, because at the time, to understand this source, you don't actually look that much at the history it's writing about, you look at the time when it was being written, because obviously they had a certain agenda in mind, and his agenda was to slate the people of Dublin. Now the reason why the people of Leinster, the Kingdom of Dublin at the time, was what stood in his way to becoming High King of Ireland. And actually what they do in the Cogath is that they try and make out that the people of Dublin are the descendants of the Vikings. So they try and pin all of these terrible atrocities on the Vikings, and then say, well, the only people who could help was my family, was my great-great-grandfather Brian Boru and his clan of the Dal Gash. And so you have to understand this. And again, I'm not going after Matt personally here. This is obviously you take sources, and it just so happens that I've written about this source, so I know a little bit more about it, which I think is why it's out of context. I don't think Matt has deliberately tried to mislead anyone with this source, but I think you have to understand that when you look at it, and actually that source about all of these things that the Vikings had been doing to everyone, every man, woman and child in Ireland. It's just another piece of propaganda that he was writing to try and frame it on the people of Dublin. And this is actually from the same source about, oh, look at how good we are, enslaving the Vikings, taking all their stuff, burning their town, and taking their women. So you see, in the same book, you have this, which is quite interesting, which just goes to show how brutal things were in Ireland at this time. And as well, these are taken from the Annals of Ulster, that spare the prayer houses and the sick from destruction, where you think, oh, that'll be a good Christian knight, of course. Well, no, that's actually Gofraith, who was a Viking leader in the 9th century. And then you see these other examples of the Irish killing each other. So you see that the southern Brega and the southern Connaught were invaded by Flan, son of Moel-Secnail. Many churches were profaned by him. Moel-Secnail, leader of the Uí Christian Irish. So you see, it's very interesting, and I'm not trying to nitpick by going, but this example and this example prove you wrong. I just think there is a large body of evidence when you look through that does suggest that actually there were plenty of people doing terrible things. Now, the reason why they've written this is probably because the Ulsters of the Annals of Ulster were not the same supporting Moel-Secnail or the other way around. So the Irish Annals were being written in different kingdoms at the time, and they also have their biases, which then proves a little bit closer to the truth, potentially, about what Christians were doing to each other. And as well, like I mentioned, the Battle of Clontarf, which is kind of seen as the end of the Viking Age, and which is what my sort of dissertation focused on, it wasn't really, it was kind of a climactic big bang, but before that they had already really waned in power for about half a century, and after that they still sort of kicked around for another half century, arguably. But that's often shown as being the Irish against the Vikings, but actually it was a completely mixed bag. Again, you have the person in rebellion, you have Mael Morda, who was king of Leinster, and he is in an alliance with Sigtryg Silkbeard, who was the Viking leader of Dublin at the time, as well as you have various, I believe, Brodir of Man, so the Isle of Man, and what was he called? The Jarl of Orkney as well were fighting on that side with the Irish. And then you have on the other side, you have Brian Boru's army, so the men of Munster and Connaught, as well as then having another troop of Vikings. I think he was called Ottar of Man, on his side. So it was a really mixed affair. And the thing in Ireland is that after a while it becomes very hard to tell apart who's a Viking, who's an Irishman, because they mixed. And actually an interesting thing is that a lot of the names became mixed as well. So actually one of the leaders is called Amlaf Curran, and it's written as in Amlaib, which looks Irish, but how do you pronounce that? Olaf. It's Olaf Curran, and Curran means shoe. So that was actually a Viking leader, and then you start to see all of these Irish-looking names, and then when you see how you pronounce them, oh, it's a Norse name written down in an Irish way, and that you'd get this whole mixed culture of what's called the Hiberno-Norse. So then you can it's very hard to tell who is sort of trying to say what at this time. And again, that just adds to the complexity of the story of the Vikings in Ireland. You get it to a lesser extent in England as well. One of the things Matt mentions is the conversion of Guthrum. Actually, when Guthrum was converted, he took a Christian name, which was Athelstan. And you see on the coins in East Anglia at the time that they started minting coins with Athelstan on there. And I actually think that it's likely that he probably did convert, because converting to Christianity, as Matt does allude to in the video, is actually quite beneficial. It adds you into this kind of UN kind of, it has lots of advantages, of course, the written word being one of the main ones with monks, monasteries, records, better taxation, things like that. And of course the Vikings were all up for that. So one of the things he says, which I did quite strongly disagree with, was that the Vikings were definitely bad for Britain, or for the British Isles, or England specifically. Now, I'd like to take a bit of a look at that. Now, his point is that obviously the Anglo-Saxon English would have hated the Vikings because they were being slaughtered by them all the time. And I think, yes, that is quite a fair assumption to make. If you are being attacked and killed by the Vikings, then you wouldn't like them very much. Again, it's debatable how much evidence we actually have of kind of population removal by the Vikings. As you can tell from DNA evidence, if whole populations were slaughtered by these people, then in the north, in the Danelaw, we wouldn't have much Anglo-Saxon DNA left. However, we do. We have a large amount of Anglo-Saxon DNA left. In fact, I think the largest proportion of Anglo-Saxon, quote-unquote, DNA was found in Yorkshire. And Yorkshire was the heart of the kingdom of Jorvik, the Viking kingdom. We also find a lot of Scandinavian DNA. I think 7% of men there have the same genome as 30% of men in Norway, which proves the kind of connection there. So I think it's much more likely that there was a lot more intermingling rather than slaughtering. But it's fair enough to say that people being killed by the Vikings wouldn't have liked them. However, I think we have a lot to thank them for, and I think people realize this as well. Now, this is an idea that, again, I picked up from Max Adams. He's an author, a historian, recently made a book about, I believe it's called Getting Along with the Vikings. Highly recommend you check it out. He's also written a book about St. Oswald, called King Oswald of Northumbria, called The King in the North, which is a great book as well as The Land of Giants, which is all that's a bit earlier. Those two are a bit earlier than this period, but Getting Along with the Vikings is a book about this era. It's about Alfred the Great at the time, and essentially it's got a lot of really interesting ideas in that I think you'll find interesting. And actually, this is an idea that he talked about in his lecture in Hexham, which I went to see. And it's about how the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons viewed land differently and viewed how sort of the geography of the land and the landscape worked differently. So these places in England are sort of some of the religious and royal centres that I could think of. So places in Northumbria, for instance, you've got Bamborough, which I put as being both because you have Lindisfarne on the other side, which is just on the other side of the strait from Bamborough, as well as Yevering, religious places like Whitby, of course, York. There was a diocese there, and technically York should be both as well because there was a royal seat there. And actually, these places, if you think about the land, like I was saying earlier with monasteries, is that things sort of worked in a ring around these places. All of the goods and all of the produce of the land and the wealth and that kind of thing, the people would come into these centres and be drawn into it. All of the things would go in there because the king would need to be paid to get the dues, the taxes, the levy, that kind of thing. So things went inwards towards these royal centres and these religious centres. However, if you look at the Vikings, the Norsemen, they have a much more outward-facing kind of view. They are, of course, foreign, which means they have connections over the water. And this meant that essentially in Anglo-Saxon England, you didn't really have towns. You kind of did in some places like London, arguably. York would have been some kind of town. But apart from that, you have farmsteads and royal estates and monasteries. That's pretty much it. But with the Vikings, when they arrive, they bring out this whole new kind of trading network. They set up whole areas in, especially York is a very good example of this. They transformed York from being a very small place that had been around in Roman times with a few walls, with a kind of church structure going on, and that was pretty much it, to a bustling town, to the capital, the second city of England, the capital of the north. And this is because they had a much more town-like structure, and actually it's even larger in Ireland. In Ireland there were no towns before the Vikings showed up. And the reason that towns did show up when they did was because in places like Dublin, of course, it was first of all a fortified encampment so that they could stay over the winter with their ships without being picked off by the Irish. And then later people would come in and settle, and they would use this as bases for raiding, bases for attacking places for monasteries and setting things up. And when more people came in, obviously the trade would increase. Dublin became a huge trading city. Again, slaves were sold in Dublin, famously Irish slaves, Slavic slaves, Anglo-Saxon slaves from all over, because the Irish, remember, were very good at slave trading. They had been at war for a long time, and they took a lot of slaves and sold them on to people like the Franks, for instance. Although you probably won't hear too much about that because, well, of course, they were both Christian, so the monks were less inclined to write this down. And actually the cities like Limerick, Dublin, Waterford, Wexford and Cork, these were the first ones that were ever seen in Ireland before the Normans, really, because the Vikings were the ones who brought this along. So that's obviously a huge thing that people had to thank them for, and I think local populations would have enjoyed that. Of course, local people had usually things to sell, and these towns would have been the perfect place, and of course there were now things to buy. The Vikings connected people to a whole trade lane in Europe. Now, of course, people had been trading before, but the Vikings essentially upped this massively. They were in contact with people in the Baltic states, so they had access to things like amber. The Swedes were sailing right the way down rivers like the Dnieper in Ukraine, and going right down to Byzantium and trading with people like the Arabs with the Caliphate of Baghdad, which is where they got their silver for their pennies. They were also, of course, trading and probably stealing and a bit of both from the Frisians and from the Franks, so they had things to sell from there, as well as obviously being involved with people in Anglo-Saxon England and later on North America. So suddenly all of these items were coming into places, mostly Dublin, but as well the other cities in Ireland, and people suddenly had, if they had the coin and the things to sell, access to this huge market that spread across the Northern Hemisphere, which, that's really something we shouldn't underestimate. And while of course the majority of people probably wouldn't be buying, silk from Persia because of the Vikings, they did add things to people's common lives that they hadn't seen before, and it revolutionized the way of life in these places about having towns, and this then spread on, and other Irish leaders started to do similar things. Of course, as well, linguistically, we get a lot of words from the Vikings, which shows that we weren't massacred, but that there was diffusion of language and culture, especially in the Danelaw in northern dialects, for instance. It's a bit of a gross one, but in my dialect, in Geordie, you say, "Oh, I'm gan yem to have some ket." Now that means I'm going home to have some sweets. Yem in Norwegian is also home, so you see that that's an influence there. And ket, actually, which is kind of a word for sweets, is actually the Old Norse word, I believe, for flesh. Now, how this has gone from being flesh to a sweet is probably because it was something that you could eat, that'd be like a treat. So it's interesting that that's in dialect, but also in standard English. Words like leg, skull, ransack, slaughter, club, odd and scathe, and you think, well, it's clear that they came in because these were all they were hacking off legs and drinking from skulls and slaughtering and ransacking and going along as they did. But we also have words like husband and sale, law, loan, thrift, skirt and cake, which really shows the trading aspect of these peoples in cities. Again, like in York, with the things that they brought along, which is very, very, very interesting. As well as husband, again, which means something like house, like a bind between the house. So, which is a bond between the house. Again, husbonde in Old Norse. And in Irish as well, we actually have a lot of words that come from Old Norse. Words like anchor, boat, market, penny, shoe, garden and cod, again indicating at the kind of relationship between them. It wasn't all hacking and killing. In fact, for the majority, it would have been peaceful relation. Things like penny, the things that they were trading, market, obviously, and other things. Of course, a lot of maritime words came in as well, because the Irish before that they were sailors, they definitely were, but they didn't really have the kind of amphibious craft that the Vikings had, the kind of long ships, and they started to use this after the Vikings. And actually in the 11th century, one of the Irish kings actually sails with a fleet and raids the Outer Hebrides, which was at that point part of a Norse kingdom. So you can see that there was a complete reversal of roles there. One last thing I'd like to pick up on was that Matt was saying that, if you're English and you're reenacting and you choose to reenact as a Viking, then it's as stupid as being Polish and deciding to reenact as a Nazi officer. Now, I think as he said it, he kind of realized that it sounded a bit ridiculous, which is fair enough. I say ridiculous things all the time, but really it depends, because actually a lot of people in the north, in the area of the Danelaw, like I was saying, have Viking ancestors and have Viking blood. So can you really go on about English and Viking? Because a lot of people up here, a bit further south than where I live in Yorkshire, and East Anglia, for instance, in sort of the Midlands, they have a lot of Scandinavian DNA. So I'm not sure where Matt is from. He sounds like he's southern, more southern than me in any case. And I'm not sure if he is from one of the areas that was, never really heavily populated. But a lot of people in the reenactment groups that I'm in a reenactment group in Regia Anglorum, a lot of the people that I know who portray Vikings, they probably have Viking DNA, so they are at least in some point Viking. And actually in the north of England, like I was saying, like with the establishment of York, actually the Anglo-Saxons fought against the English, against the Mercians and the men of Wessex, when they tried to capture York from the Danes. And actually, very interestingly actually, is that the Archbishopric of York actually sided with the Danes in the Great Heathen Army, because they were so sick of the civil war that was going on in Northumbria between various factions. And actually they got on really well with the Danes, and it's not for no reason that there are churches all over York called St. Olaf's Church. In Dublin, for example, Sigtryg Silkbeard, although he lost the Battle of Clontarf, went on to found Trinity Church in Dublin. So, that's just another thing. So I think essentially what I'm trying to say here is that it really depends on how you look at it. And I think the example was quite a bad one, but I think you realize that anyway. And that really a lot of people are part Viking, and in the north it's quite a strong identity. There definitely were ties and still are ties. In York, lots of the streets go back to Viking names. Gudrum Gate is Guthrum's Gata, which is street. You have things like Coppergate, the street where people were selling things like copper, for example. So you see that it's really in a lot of the place names as well. York is essentially a shortened version of Jorvik. You have other places like Thursby, well, that's Thor's village. So they weren't like Nazi invaders in that sense. It was a very different situation back then, and I think it does make a lot of sense why some people would choose to do that. And as well, if you sort of follow that line, well then why would anyone choose to be a Roman, choose to reenact a Roman? Surely, by the definitions you've set for being morally good or morally bad, and I know you didn't really say all the Vikings were evil or anything like that, I'm not trying to misconstrue your argument, but surely then the Romans would be absolutely awful. The amount of slaves they took, the women, the rape of the Sabine women, with all the Celtic peoples they displaced and massacred and gloated about. And then surely no one in the British Isles, unless they were properly Italian, would be able to play as the Romans, reenact as the Romans, because we have such little Roman DNA left. Then surely most people should just be content with going Britain, because apparently British DNA, or British, dare I say Celtic DNA, is the most commonly found throughout Britain. So I don't know, those are a few things to think about. So thanks very much for watching. I hope Matt does see this video, and I hope you guys have enjoyed this actually. I know it's been very rambly and actually very long, and rest in peace, there goes my battery. But I hope it's been interesting. I've had a lot of excuses to talk about a lot of different things, and actually last weekend I was at the Jorvik Viking Festival in my gear fighting for Regia Anglorum, and actually the Saxons won that time. Not actually what happened in 865, unfortunately. But I'm going to have a video about Viking York coming out very soon, and I need to stop this before my battery runs out and I have to record everything again. So thanks for watching. I'm History with Hilbert. Do check out Scholagladiatoria, and don't forget to give me a thumbs up and subscribe if you're new. Thanks for watching.